I spent 20 years on the streets of Chicago wearing a badge and walking a beat that most people wouldn't even drive through with their doors locked. When you spend 2 decades in law enforcement, you develop a certain kind of radar. It's not something they teach you at the academy, and it's not something you can pick up from a textbook. It's a gut feeling that comes from looking into the eyes of thousands of people who are trying to sell you a version of the truth that doesn't exist. I've been lied to by the best of them. I've had murderers cry on my shoulder, swearing on their mother's grave that they weren't there, only for me to find the weapon in their glove box 10 minutes later. I've seen the way a person's pupils dilate when they know they're cornered, and I've heard the specific tremor in a voice that's trying to bridge the gap between a fantasy and a felony. By the time I walked onto the set of my own show, my patience for excuses had been burned away by years of seeing the wreckage that lies leave behind. I don't have time for the games anymore. I don't have the energy to sit back and let someone weave a web of nonsense while a victim is sitting 3 feet away, bleeding internally from the weight of what's been done to them. People ask me why I get so angry, why I get in people's faces. And the answer is simple. I can't stand a bully and I can't stand a liar. And when you combine those two things, you get the kind of person who thinks they can terrorize the people who gave them life and then sit on my stage and act like they're the one being misunderstood. That's what brought me to the case of Marcus. Before the cameras even started rolling, I sat in my dressing room looking at the files, and I could feel that old familiar heat rising in my chest. This wasn't just a rebellious kid or a teenager going through a phase. This was something much darker. I saw the photos of the house, the holes in the drywall, the shattered mirrors, the locks that the parents had to install on their own bedroom door just so they could sleep through the night without looking over their shoulders. These were parents, Mary and David, who looked like they hadn't had a full night's rest in 3 years. They looked haunted. They didn't look like they were coming on a talk show for fame. They looked like they were coming for a lifeline because they were drowning in their own living room. And then there was Marcus, 17 years old, built like a linebacker with a chip on his shoulder the size of a city block. In his intake interview, he was arrogant. He smirked at the producers. He talked about his parents like they were his employees, people who existed only to serve his needs and stay out of his way. He didn't see them as human beings. He saw them as obstacles. I walked out onto that stage, and the air felt heavy. You can usually tell the vibe of the crowd within the first 10 seconds. Sometimes they're rowdy, sometimes they're curious, but today they were quiet. They had seen the intro package. They had seen Mary crying, describing how Marcus had pinned her against the kitchen counter because she didn't have $20 to give him for cigarettes. They had heard David talk about the time Marcus threatened to burn the house down while they were inside it. When I sat down in my chair and looked over at Mary and David, I saw two people who were completely broken. They were sitting on the edge of the seats, shoulders hunched, almost as if they were waiting for an explosion. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and I told them right then that they didn't have to be afraid here, not in my house, not today. I told them that the reign of terror ended the second they walked through those studio doors. Then I called Marcus out. He didn't walk, he strutted. He had that specific gait that young punks use when they want everyone to think they're the toughest guy in the room, shoulders back, chin up, a look of pure disdain on his face. He sat down, slumped into the chair, and didn't even look at his parents. He looked at me, trying to size me up. I've had guys 3 times the size try to intimidate me in dark alleys, so a 17-year-old with a bad attitude wasn't going to make me blink. I let the silence hang for a moment, letting him sit in the discomfort of a room full of people who knew exactly what kind of person he was. He tried to maintain that tough guy mask, but I could see the twitch in his jaw. He was used to being the loudest, most aggressive person in the room. He was used to people backing down when he raised his voice or squared his shoulders, but I don't back down. I move in. I started off simple. I asked him if he loved his mother. He gave me a half shrug, a non-committal grunt that made my blood boil. I asked him again, louder this time, making sure he knew that the cool kid act wasn't going to fly here. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "She's all right when she stays off my back." That was it. That was the moment I knew there was no middle ground with this kid. He didn't see his mother as someone who had nurtured him, someone who was currently paying for the clothes on his back and the roof over his head. He saw her as a nuisance. I looked over at Mary. and I saw her flinch at his words. She had spent 17 years trying to love the monster out of him, and he just spat on it in front of a national audience. David tried to speak up, tried to say that they just wanted their son back, but Marcus snapped at him, telling him to shut up before he regretted it. I stood up. I don't usually stand up that early in the show, but I couldn't sit there and listen to a kid threaten his father while I was in the room. I walked over to him, getting into his personal space, the way I used to do in the interrogation room when I knew a suspect was about to crack. I told him that the only person who was going to regret anything today was him. I told him that he was a coward. That's the word they hate the most. These kids think they're alpha. They think they're warriors because they can intimidate a woman who weighs 100 pounds less than them. I told them that real men protect their families. They don't terrorize them. I pointed to the holes in the wall in the photos behind us and asked him if that made him feel powerful. He tried to laugh it off, tried to say it wasn't a big deal, that they pushed him to it. That's the classic abuser's line. Look what you made me do. It's the oldest lie in the book. I've heard it from domestic abusers, from street thugs, and now I was hearing it from a teenager who thought he was entitled to be a tyrant. I looked him in the eye and I told him, nobody makes you put your hands on your mother. Nobody makes you threaten to kill your father. You do that because you're a bully who thinks there are no consequences. Well, guess what, Marcus? I'm the consequence. He tried to look away, but I moved with him. I wouldn't let him escape the reality of what he was. I made him look at the screen, at the image of his mother's bruised arm from the week before. I asked him, is this what a man does? He remained silent, but the cocky smirk was starting to fade. The reality of the situation was starting to sink in. He wasn't in his living room anymore, where he could just break a chair to get his way. He was in a place where his actions were being held up to the light, and the light was blinding. I moved even closer to him, so close I could smell the stale smoke on his breath and see the way his eyes were darting around, looking for an exit that didn't exist. I told him to look at his father. David was sitting there, a man who had worked 40 years to provide a life for a son who now treated him like an enemy combatant. I asked Marcus, what did he ever do to you besides give you a name and a roof? Marcus didn't answer at first. He just chewed on his lip, his leg bouncing nervously. Then he tried to flip the script. This is the part where the liar tries to become the victim. He started telling me that David was controlling, that he didn't let him breathe, that the reason he got frustrated was because he was being treated like a prisoner in his own home. He actually had the nerve to say that the locks on the doors were the reason he was angry. I looked at him like he was the most pathetic thing I'd ever seen. I told him, they put locks on those doors because they're afraid you're going to kill them in their sleep. You didn't get locks because you were a victim. You got locks because you're a predator. He didn't like that. He stood up, chest out, trying to puff himself up. For a split second, he forgot where he was. He forgot he wasn't in his hallway at home where he could just shove someone out of the way. He looked at me like he wanted to swing. I didn't move an inch. I've had professional fighters and career criminals try to intimidate me, and this kid thought a mean look was going to make me back down. I told him, sit down before you do something that's going to land you in a cell tonight. You think you're tough? You think you're the man? Sit the hell down. He hesitated, his ego warring with the reality that I wasn't scared of him. Slowly, he sat back down, but he was still vibrating with that toxic energy. He started muttering under his breath about how this was all bullshit and how nobody knew the full story. That's when I decided it was time to move into the evidence. I leaned back and pulled the folder from under my chair. I told the audience, and I told him, that we had sent the team to their house. We had talked to the neighbors. We had seen the police reports from the 4 times the cops had been called to that residence in the last 6 months alone. I read from a report where a neighbor heard Marcus screaming that he was going to end them both while he was smashing the windows of his father's truck with a lead pipe. I looked at him and asked, was that self-defense too? Was the truck being controlling Marcus? He didn't have an answer. He just looked at the floor. The tough guy was starting to leak air. He was realizing that his excuses weren't holding up under the weight of the facts. But the biggest lie was still sitting there, waiting to be exposed. Marcus had told our producers that he had never, ever physically struck his mother. He claimed that any bruises she had were from accidents or from her tripping during their arguments. He swore on everything he held sacred, which wasn't much, that he was not a woman beater. He knew that even in his world, hitting your mother is the lowest of the low. It's the one thing that even the worst street punks usually won't admit to. Mary was sitting there, listening to him lie, and I could see the pain in her eyes. It wasn't just the physical pain of what he'd done. It was the betrayal of hearing her own child treat her like she was crazy. I asked her, Mary, did he hit you? She couldn't even speak at first. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face. Marcus immediately jumped in, screaming at her, telling her she was a liar, telling her she was trying to ruin his life. I stopped him cold. I told him that the only person ruining his life was the person he saw in the mirror every morning. I told him we were going to find out the truth right now. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the yellow envelope, the polygraph results. This is the moment where the air leaves the room. Every liar thinks they can beat the box. They think they're so smart, so manipulative, that they can trick a machine. They think if they believe their own lie hard enough, it becomes the truth. But the box doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care about your excuses. It measures the physiological response of a person who is trying to deceive, and Marcus was a walking deception. I held the envelope up. I asked him one last time, Marcus, did you ever put your hands on your mother in an aggressive way? Did you ever strike her, shove her, or cause those bruises? He looked at the envelope, then at me, then at his parents. He was cornered. You could see the gears turning in his head, trying to find a way to spin it. He said, maybe I pushed her once, but it wasn't like they're saying it wasn't a big deal. I told him, pushing your mother is a big deal. Shoving the woman who gave you life is a big deal, but that's not what the question was. The question was, did you hit her? He went back to the lie. He said, no, I never hit her. I opened the envelope. I didn't rush it. I wanted him to feel every second of that silence. I wanted him to understand that the game was over. I looked at the results, and then I looked at him. I didn't feel happy. I felt a profound sense of disgust. I told the audience, we asked Marcus if he ever physically struck his mother. He said no. I paused, letting the tension build until it was almost unbearable. The polygraph determined that was a lie. He failed every single question regarding physical violence toward his parents. The room erupted. The audience was on their feet, and for the first time, Marcus looked small. He didn't look like a linebacker. He looked like a scared little boy who'd been caught with his hand in the cookie jar, except the cookie jar was his mother's face. He started trying to scream over the noise, saying the test was rigged, saying he was nervous, saying the guy who ran the test didn't like him. I've heard it all before. Every person who fails a polygraph has an excuse for why the machine is wrong, but the machine is rarely wrong about a guy like Marcus. His body knew he was lying, even if his mouth wouldn't admit it. I walked over to Mary and David. I ignored Marcus entirely for a moment. I looked at these two people who were shaking, who were staring at their son like they didn't recognize him. I told them, you don't have to live like this. You've done everything you could. You've given him 100 chances, and he's used every one of them to hurt you. It's okay to stop. It's okay to say no more. David looked at me, and I saw a tear roll down his cheek. He said, he's my son, Steve. And I told him something that's hard for a lot of parents to hear. He might be your son, but he's also an adult who's making a choice to be a criminal. You are not responsible for his choices anymore. You are responsible for your own safety. I turned back to Marcus. He was still trying to maintain his posture, but he was shaking. I could see it in his hands. He was losing control of the room, and for a bully, losing control is the ultimate nightmare. I got right in his face, my nose inches from his. I told him, you're a failure, not because you're 17 and don't have a job, and not because you're failing school. You're a failure because you failed the most basic test of being a human being. You didn't protect your family. You became the thing they need protection from. I told him that if I were his father, he wouldn't be sitting here. He'd be sitting in a precinct waiting for a bond hearing. I told him he was lucky his parents were better people than he deserved. The air in the studio was thick, the kind of heavy you only feel when a lie has been stripped naked and there's nowhere left for it to hide. Marcus was vibrating with a mixture of rage and panic. I've seen that look on 1,000 faces in the back of a squad car. It's the look of a person who realizes The walls are closing in, and their usual tricks, the shouting, the intimidation, the manipulation, aren't working anymore. He tried to stand up again, his face turning a dark shade of purple, shouting that the test was a setup, that I was in on it with his parents. I didn't move. I stood my ground, my feet planted, looking him right in those angry, entitled eyes. I told him to sit his ass back down. I told him that the only thing set up here was the trap he built for himself the moment he decided to treat his mother like a punching bag and his father like a doormat. He didn't sit. He started pacing, looking at the exit, then looking at the crowd, who were booing him with a ferocity that usually rattles even the most hardened criminals. But Marcus was in deep. He was so addicted to his own narrative of being the victim that he couldn't even see the wreckage he was causing in real time. I looked over at Mary. She was sobbing, her head in her hands. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment the last bit of hope that her son might be telling the truth was extinguished. I've seen it 100 times. The heartbreak of a mother realizing she raised someone she doesn't recognize. I walked over to her, ignoring Marcus's posturing, and I put a hand on her shoulder. I told her, Mary, look at me. This isn't your fault. You didn't teach him this. You didn't tell him it was okay to be a monster. He chose this. Marcus heard me and lost it. He started screaming at me, calling me every name in the book. He told me I didn't know him, that I didn't know what he'd been through. I turned around and I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has heard the same woe is me story from every two-bit thug from the south side to the suburbs. I told him, you're right, Marcus. I don't know your whole life, but I know your character. I know that when you're caught in a lie, you yell. When you're faced with the truth, you try to fight. And when you're asked to take responsibility, you blame everyone but the person in the mirror. I asked him, what have you been through that justifies hitting your mother? Did she starve you? Did she beat you? Did she abandon you? David, the father, spoke up then. His voice was shaking, but he was finally finding his spine. He said, no, Steve. We gave him everything. We bought him the car he smashed. We paid for the lawyers the last time he got into trouble. We've done nothing but try to help him. That's the part that really gets to me, the entitlement. We live in a world where some kids think that because they have a heartbeat, the world owes them a living and their parents owe them total submission. Marcus looked at his father with such pure, unadulterated hatred that it made my skin crawl. He told David to shut up or else. That was the or else that had been keeping them prisoners in their own home. I stepped back into Marcus's line of sight. I told him, there is no or else here. Not today. You want to be the big man? You want to show everyone how tough you are? Try doing it with me. Try threatening someone who isn't afraid of you. He didn't have anything to say to that. He just glared, his chest heaving. I looked at the audience, then back at Marcus. I wanted to break down for him exactly what he was. I told him that in my 20 years as a cop, I dealt with people who had nothing. People who grew up in the worst conditions imaginable, who had every reason to be angry at the world, and yet they still managed to treat their mothers with respect. I told him he was a spoiled bully who used his size and his temper to get his way because he was too lazy and too weak to earn anything on his own. I told him that hitting a woman, especially the woman who birthed him, was the ultimate sign of a coward. I told him he wasn't a man, he was a failed experiment in adulthood. The tension was so high you could practically hear it humming in the rafters. I could see Marcus was on the verge of either a total meltdown or a violent outburst. I've been in enough rooms to know when the air is about to ignite. I signaled to my security team to move in a little closer, just in case. I didn't want him touching his parents again. I told Mary and David that they needed to make a choice. I told them that as long as they kept making excuses for him, as long as they kept letting him back into that house after he terrorized them, they were just waiting for a tragedy to happen. I asked David, are you waiting for her to end up in the hospital? Are you waiting for him to follow through on those threats to burn the house down? David looked down at his shoes. He knew I was right. He said, I don't know what to do, Steve. He has nowhere else to go. I told him that Marcus had exactly where he needed to go. Out of their house, out of their bank account, and into the real world where the police and the judges don't care about his feelings or his frustrations. I told them that the greatest act of love they could show him now was to let him hit rock bottom. Because right now, they were his enablers. They were the ones providing the stage for his little drama. I looked at Marcus and told him, "You think you're so tough? Let's see how tough you are when you're sleeping in a shelter or on a bench. Let's see how many people out there care about your bad day when you start smashing things." Marcus tried one last time to gain control. He looked at his mom and his voice changed. He tried to do that manipulative whine that abusers use when they're cornered. He said, "Mom, you know I didn't mean it. You know I love you." Tell him he's wrong. Tell him about the good times. It was sickening. It was like watching a snake shed its skin. One minute he was a screaming predator. The next he was a misunderstood son. I didn't let her answer. I stepped between them. I told him, "Don't you dare. Don't you dare try to pull that garbage now. You don't love her. You love what she does for you. You love that she's a target you can hit whenever you feel small. If you loved her, you wouldn't have lied about hitting her 10 minutes ago. If you loved her, you wouldn't make her afraid to sleep in her own bed." I turned to the camera, speaking directly to the people watching at home. I told them that this wasn't just about Marcus. This was about every person out there who thinks that family is a license to abuse. I said that blood doesn't give you the right to be a tyrant. I said that if someone in your life is terrorizing you, it doesn't matter if they're your son, your daughter, or your spouse. You have a right to be safe. You have a right to peace. I could see the audience nodding. They had seen this story play out in their own neighborhoods, maybe even their own homes. I looked back at Marcus. He had finally sat down, but he was staring at the floor, his face a mask of cold, hard resentment. He wasn't sorry. He was just mad he got caught. He was mad that the Steve Wilkos show hadn't been the easy ride he thought it would be. He probably thought he could come on here, charm the crowd, and make his parents look like the crazy ones. He didn't realize that I've spent my life looking at guys like him. I've seen him in the back of the wagon, I've seen him in the holding cell, and I've seen him in the courtroom. He's not special. He's just another bully who ran out of road. I asked Mary one last question. I asked her, "If he walks out those doors and goes back to your house tonight, do you feel safe?" She looked at Marcus, then she looked at me. And for the first time, she spoke with a clear, firm voice. She said, "No, I don't." I told her, "Then he doesn't go back, not tonight, not until he's had a lot of help and shown a lot of change." I looked at David and told him he had to be the one to enforce that. I told him he had to be the man Marcus refused to be. I told him he had to protect his wife from his son. I looked at David and I saw the internal struggle playing out on his face. It's the struggle every parent of a wayward kid goes through, that desperate, clawing desire to believe that one more chance will be the one that works. But I've been on enough domestic calls to know that one more chance is usually just an invitation for the next assault. I've walked into houses where the walls were covered in blood because a parent couldn't say no to a child who had turned into a predator. I told David, and I said it loud enough for everyone in that room to hear, that being a father doesn't mean being a victim. I told him that his primary responsibility in this world at this moment was the woman sitting next to him who was shaking like a leaf because her own son was a threat to her life. I told him that if he let Marcus back into that house tonight, he was choosing Marcus over Mary. I told him that was a choice he couldn't take back if things went south. Marcus was sitting there, his eyes darting back and forth, and I could see he was looking for a crack in the armor. He was looking for that one bit of guilt he could exploit. He started in again, his voice low and toxic. He said to David, "You're really going to listen to this guy? You're going to let him tell you what to do with your own family?" He was trying to pivot, trying to make me the outsider, the intruder. It's a classic move. When the truth is too heavy to carry, you try to attack the person holding the light. I stepped right back into his space. I didn't give him an inch. I told him, I'm not the one who hit his mother, Marcus. I'm not the one who failed the lie detector test on national television. You did this. You brought this on yourself. You came here thinking you could lie to me, lie to your parents, and lie to this audience. And now that you're caught, you want to talk about family? You don't know the first thing about family. I turned my back on him. That's a move I learned a long time ago. It shows them they don't have power over you. It shows them they aren't the center of the universe. I looked at the crowd and I said, this is what we deal with. We deal with people who think that their anger is an excuse for anything. They think that because they're frustrated, they have the right to destroy the lives of the people who love them. I told the audience that Marcus represents a specific kind of rot, a lack of accountability that is eating away at the foundation of the home. I wasn't just talking to the people in the seats, I was talking to the millions watching at home who are living in their own personal hell because they're afraid of their own children. I told them that the fear ends when you decide it ends. Marcus couldn't take being ignored. He jumped up and started screaming at the top of his lungs. He was swearing, calling me names, threatening to do something if I didn't get out of his face. I didn't flinch. I turned around slowly, looked him up and down, and I told him, do it. Show everyone right now exactly what you are. You want to swing? You want to prove me right? Go ahead. But understand this. When you do, the game is over. There are 3 police officers off stage, and you'll be in handcuffs before you hit the ground. Is that how you want this to end? Because I'm fine with that. The silence that followed was deafening. He was standing there, his fist clenched, his face bright red, but he didn't move. He knew that for the first time in his life, he was up against the wall he couldn't break down with the tantrum. I told him to sit down, and this time, he did it. The fight had drained out of him, replaced by a cold, simmering resentment. He looked like a cornered animal. I went back to Mary and David. I told them that we had a program. We had a place where Marcus could go, a place with structure, with discipline, and with people who wouldn't be intimidated by his act. I told him it wasn't a vacation. It was a chance for him to fix what was broken inside him before he ended up in a state prison. I asked Marcus, are you man enough to admit you have a problem? Are you man enough to try to change? Or are you just going to be a loser for the rest of your life? He didn't answer. He just stared at the floor. I told him that silence was his answer. I told him that his silence proved he wasn't ready to be a man. This is the part where people expect a hug and a will get through this moment. But that's not who I am. I'm not a therapist. I'm a guy who has seen the end result of this kind of behavior too many times. I told Mary and David that I wouldn't force them to do anything, but I was offering them a way out. I told them my security would escort Marcus to the hotel, and from there, if he agreed, he would go to the treatment facility. If he didn't, he was on his own. I told them they needed to change the locks on their doors the second they got home. I told them they needed to file for a restraining order. I told them that until he could prove he wasn't a threat, he didn't belong in our home. The moral weight of that moment was heavy. You could see the heartbreak on Mary's face as she realized that she was effectively saying goodbye to her son, at least the version of him she had held in her heart. But I could also see a tiny spark of relief. The weight of the secret was gone. The world knew what she was going through, and she didn't have to hide the bruises anymore. I told her, you are a good mother. You didn't fail him. He failed you. I've said those words to a lot of parents, and I mean it every single time. We like to think that we can control how our kids turn out, but at the end of the day, they make their own choices. Marcus chose to be a bully. Marcus chose to be a liar. Marcus chose to be a coward. I looked at Marcus one last time. I didn't see a tough guy. I didn't see a threat. I saw a kid who had wasted every gift he'd ever been given. I told him, you're going to walk off this stage in a minute, and you have a choice. You can go to that facility and try to become someone your parents can be proud of, or you can keep going down this path. But let me tell you something, from someone who has spent 20 years watching guys on your path, it only ends in 2 places. It ends in a prison cell or it ends in a graveyard. There is no third option for people like you. He didn't look up. He didn't say a word. I signaled for security. 2 of my guys, big guys, who don't take any nonsense, stepped up and stood on either side of him. I told them to take him off. As he walked away, he didn't look back at his parents. He didn't say he was sorry. He just walked off with that same arrogant gait, trying to salvage whatever was left of his pride. I watched him go, and I felt a sense of profound disappointment. You always hope for that moment of clarity, that moment where they realize the damage they've done. But for some people, the ego is just too thick. For some people, the lie is more comfortable than the truth. I sat back down with Mary and David for a moment. The cameras were still rolling, but it felt like the rest of the world had faded away. I told them that the next few months were going to be hard. I told them they were going to feel guilty. They were going to want to call him, to check on him, to let him come home for Sunday dinner. I told them they couldn't do it. I told them that every time they gave in, they were just feeding the monster. I told David, you have to be the rock for her. You have to be the one to say no when she's feeling weak, and she has to do the same for you. They held each other's hands, and for the first time since they walked out, they looked like a team. They didn't look like two people waiting to be attacked. The stage went quiet after the security doors closed behind Marcus. That's a silence I've grown accustomed to over the years, but it never gets easier to sit in. It's the sound of a family unit that has been completely dismantled. People think that when the bad guy gets escorted off, it's a victory, but there are no winners in a situation like this. Mary and David didn't look like they had won anything. They looked like they had just survived a car wreck. I stayed out there with them for a few minutes while the crew started resetting the lights for the next segment. I told them again that the hardest part was over. The secret was out. The lie had been killed. I saw David put his arm around Mary, and for the first time, she didn't look like she was bracing for a blow. She just looked tired. I watched them walk off toward the wings, and I hoped to God they would follow through with what we discussed. I hope they would find the strength to keep those doors locked, because the world is full of guys like Marcus who think that a mother's love is a weakness they can exploit forever. I walked back to my dressing room, and I could still feel the adrenaline vibrating in my hands. People ask me all the time if it's an act, if I just ramp it up for the cameras. They don't understand. When I see a kid like that, I don't just see a difficult teenager. I see every victim of domestic violence I ever had to interview in a cold hospital room. I see the women with broken orbital bones who told me they fell down the stairs because they were too terrified of the man in the next room to tell the truth. I see the elderly parents who were robbed by their own children to fund a habit or a lifestyle they didn't earn. My anger isn't for show, it's a shield. I use it to stand in the gap for people who have been silenced by fear. If I have to be the loudest person in the room to make a bully sit down, then that's what I'm gonna do. Marcus thinks he's a victim because I called him out. He'll probably go back to his friends or his social media and talk about how unfair the show was. He'll say the polygraph was fake and that I'm just a mean guy who didn't listen to his side. But the truth doesn't need his permission to be the truth. Those bruises on Mary's arm weren't fake. The fear in David's voice wasn't an act. The holes in those walls were real. Marcus is at a crossroads now, and the path he chooses will determine whether he spends his life as a man or a number in a system. I've seen both. I've seen guys turn it around, and I've seen guys end up on a slab because they thought they were untouchable. The tragedy is that some people have to lose everything before they realize that respect isn't something you demand with your fist, it's something you earn with your character. I sat there in the quiet of my room thinking about the cycle of violence. It starts small. It starts with a shove, a slammed door, a threat that goes unchallenged, then it grows. It becomes a punch, a broken window, a life lived in a state of constant, low-level terror. By the time someone gets to my stage, the cycle is usually at its breaking point. I'm just the guy who provides the hammer to break it. I told my producers later that I want to follow up on Mary and David every week. I want to know if he tried to come back. I want to know if they stood their ground. Because my job doesn't end when the red light on the camera goes off. I take these people home with me. I carry their stories in the back of my mind when I'm trying to sleep. The world can be a dark place, and the darkest parts are often behind closed doors where no one can see. If you're sitting at home and you recognize yourself in Mary or David, if you're living with someone who makes you feel like a prisoner in your own house, I'm telling you right now, speak up. Don't wait for the right time, because the right time never comes. Don't wait for them to change, because bullies only change when they're forced to face a consequence they can't manipulate. Your safety is more important than their ego. Your peace of mind is more important than their excuses. You don't owe an abuser your life, no matter what their relationship is to you. Stand up, find your voice, and don't let the lies win. I'm Steve Wilkos, and I'll be here as long as there are people who need a voice. If you need help, reach out to a local domestic violence hotline or your local authorities. Don't live in fear another day.